This time, let us look at Luke chapter 23, and we're going to look at one verse this time, and it's going to be verse 46. So take your mobile, take your computer, take your Bible, and join with me as we study this part in Luke 23. Throughout this series, I've been showing that Jesus and his ministry is 100% about how you interpret the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, the writings, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. Those books considered the Hebrew Bible because it's all written in Hebrew or Aramaic. It is about how you interpret those scriptures, and how you interpret them help you understand Jesus. So the thing that I want to focus on is something that's very important for us to understand Luke 23 verse 46, and that's the concept of when the New Testament begins. And we'll read verse 46 here real quick, and then I want to address some ideas. Luke 23 verse 46, the King James. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And having said this, he gave up the ghost. So let's backtrack and let's look at some things through the Torah. What does the Torah say about a covenant? Well, it says that it requires blood. Many of the covenants that you find in the Torah require blood. Go back to Genesis 15. God has a covenant with Abram. Even though he becomes Abraham, he's Abram at this point. And it is so Abram will know that he will receive God's promises. So in Genesis 15 and verse 9, God tells Abraham, bring a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon. And Abram sacrifices those animals. He puts them into two pieces, part on the left, part on the right. And what you have is later in the night you have God walking through those pieces, but Abram does not walk through those pieces. Now what that is this is a very ancient way of showing on the left and on the right. What you have is parties walking through these things because they are going to say, we are going to be faithful to this covenant that we've cut together, because if neither one of us are going to be faithful, then we will do to each other what we did to these animals. And the only one who walks through those animals is God. So this is a one-sided covenant from God to Abram. And this is a very important concept, that we see this, and we see that Abram did not walk through the pieces. However, when you come down to Genesis 17, God does ask Abram to be faithful, and this is through the covenant of circumcision. So circumcision is a type of bloodshed on the male's behalf for Abram, who becomes Abraham, and his sons and his household all have to be circumcised in order to be faithful to this covenant that God has with Abraham. So what gets out of that and what comes down is that the boys, the infants, are circumcised on day 8. But it means that Ishmael was not sacrificed, sorry about that. It means that Ishmael was circumcised. It means Isaac was circumcised. It means all the sons of the concubines were circumcised, and all the men of Abraham's house were circumcised. So it means the 12 sons of Jacob are circumcised, just like Jacob himself. And this gets passed all the way down to Jesus, and Jesus himself is circumcised. You can see that in Luke 2, verse 21. So we're still talking about covenants being cut in blood, though. So take a look at Exodus 21. The covenant, which is called the Mosaic covenant by a lot of folks, is a covenant between God and Israel, the nation of Israel. So God made a covenant with Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and then makes a covenant with the people called Israel. So this is a covenant which is cut through blood. Now some might assume that it's the blood of the firstborn, which is lost by the Egyptians and those that didn't obey back in Exodus when they left Egypt, but that's not the case. The covenant is ratified through the blood which is shed at Sinai. Exodus 24, 4-8 says this: Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, which is Yud He Vav He, and he rose up early in the morning. That's Moses. He built an altar upon the hill, the 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he, being Moses, sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord, which is Yud He Vav He. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord, Yed-Heh-Vav-Heh, has said we will do and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled the blood on the people, and said, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord, Yed-Heh-Vav-Heh, has made with you concerning all these words. So it's important that the covenant is actually read to the people. They agree to it. Then Moses takes blood and sprinkles it on the altar, and he takes blood and sprinkles it on the people. And so both parties of the covenant has solidified the covenant, and they've ratified it together. So this motif continues. This is something that is seen and is understood when we interpret the Bible. And you move down to Jeremiah 31, chapter 31, beginning with verse 31 through 34. There's a prophecy of a new covenant with the house of Judah and with the house of Israel. So not only is it going to be a reunification covenant, I suppose, but it is also a covenant that will have to be ratified in blood. So you come down to Luke 22, verse 20, and we talked about it last time, and he says that you take of a particular cup, and when you drink of that particular cup, you are remembering the blood. But we also talked that this was for the promises, which were going back to Exodus 6, 6, and 7. Not only is it aligning with the promises, it's aligning with the concept of a blood sacrifice. Blood being the ratification of the covenant. So it takes Jesus and his shedding of his blood to ratify the new covenant. Now, we know this because if you look at Hebrews chapter 9, verse 16, it tells us that the covenant takes effect at death. Because without death there is no covenant or no testator. Now, some translations use the word will, but we're looking at the concept of a covenant. So it can't just be that he gets his lashings and he sheds blood that way. He has to actually die. And those animals back at Exodus, at the ratification of the law of Moses, where the covenant between God and Israel had to be covered with blood. So Jesus in Luke 23, verse 46 says, and when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he gave up his ghost. So this is when the New Testament begins. Some people think that it actually begins with the page right before Matthew, and that Matthew 1:1 and Mark 1:1 and Luke 1:1 and John 1:1 all begin the New Testament, but that's not the case. So Jesus is from Luke 1:1 all the way to chapter 23, verse 45 is in the Old Testament. And that's because it takes his death to give us the New Testament. Now, what's important about this is seeing when the New Testament begins. Some people believe that it's not at Jesus' death. It's actually over here in Acts chapter 2. But that's not when the New Covenant takes effect. It takes effect at the death. And we see that because of what we read in Hebrews. All of this matters because it shows us when do we interpret his death. How do we interpret the New Testament? So some people say, okay, since Jesus died and he dies under the old covenant, then all of his teachings in his ministry don't have to be listened to. And that's an unfortunate interpretation, because if we don't listen to those teachings, we're not listening to the anointed, even though the anointed has chosen apostles and those who will teach things from there. But we can't just say that it begins over here with his death or at the day of Pentecost, because we would not listen to all of these teachings. These are very important concepts. So, even though Jesus and the bulk of his teachings are Old Testament, it goes back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. And Jesus is not going to nullify his own teachings. So his teachings do take effect, and they do have their purpose in the New Testament. So even though he's the anointed, and I believe he's anointed, and that he is the last prophet of the Old Testament, it doesn't take away his teachings. These things are important to how we live in the New Covenant and what it means to be in that New Covenant. So when we realize when the New Testament begins, we have to see that because Jesus is a Jew and he does things according to the Jewish understanding and interpretation, then we're going to understand that his teachings, that while they are Old Testament, they still have their validity. And it makes a difference in how we interpret his ministry and how we interpret his death. And that while his teachings were to the Jews, they're not only for the Jews. This is how we live life according to what God gave as instructions back here in the law. And those instructions are valid in the new covenant. These are important. So it involves Jesus not only in his use of the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, or the law, the prophets, and the writings, but it has interpretation purposes of how we interpret his death and what his death means. And then what his teachings mean, which occurred before his death. And what did his teachings mean after his death? Now these are things that get wrestled with, they get discussed quite a bit, and are important. I'm going to show us in our last segment with Luke, over in Luke 24, how important it is that we see the law, the prophets, and the writings, and what they mean as a Bible unit, and how Jesus used them.